Let's go ahead and jump into this. If this is your first time here, we're in this series called More to the Story. And what we're doing is we're going through Hebrews chapter 11. We refer to it a lot of times as the Hall of Faith. And the writer mentions all of these incredible individuals, and they're being recognized for their faith and their trust and just their dependence on God. And some are mentioned by name, some are just kind of referenced a little bit more generically. But as we're coming to these names, what we're doing is we're going back to the Old Testament and we're looking at their story a little bit more in depth. There's no way we can cover it all, but we're just wanting to get a better picture of why they are mentioned here in the Hall of Faith. All right? So last week, Pastor Michael, if you were with us, he introduced us to the man Joseph. And if you weren't here to hear the message, I would encourage you to go online, go back and listen to it. It'd be worth your time. But you can't do that right now, so let me try to quickly catch you up to where we are, okay? That way you'll have a little bit better idea of where we're going today. So the story of Joseph kind of begins where, as a young boy, God reveals to him some things about his future. Joseph has a dream, and God allows him to interpret that dream. And, well, Joseph, being a young boy, he's not very wise about how he shares this dream, because the dream basically was that one day his brothers were going to bow down to him. And so when he shares this with his brothers, they didn't like the idea of that too much, especially with Joseph being the youngest of the brothers. And it didn't help matters that Jacob, Joseph's dad, had already made it more than clear that Joseph was his favorite son. So much so that he went and had a special coat made just for Joseph, a coat of many colors. So Jacob made no bones about it. Joseph is my favorite son. Just quick side note here, just a side thought for you. Have you ever noticed this about Joseph? Joseph was always someone's favorite. I mean, he is the favorite son of his father. We're going to see today he is the favorite of Potiphar. And then we'll even see he's actually the favorite of Mrs. Potiphar. But anyway, we'll keep moving. And so Jacob sends Joseph out. Hey, Jacob or Joseph, go check on the other boys, see how they're doing as they're out watching sheep. And as they see him approaching, they're like, oh, here he comes again. Let's just go ahead and kill him. Talk about how things escalate quickly. They're like, let's kill him. We're tired of dealing with him. Well, Reuben, being the oldest, is like, no, we can't kill him. So their brilliant idea is we're just going to beat him up, we're going to throw him in a pit, and then we'll figure out what to do with him, all right? So they do all of this, and so what they do is they decide to go kill an animal, take the blood of that animal. They took the coat off of Joseph, ripped it in shreds, put the blood all over the coat, and go back to their dad and said, Dad, we don't know how to tell you this, but Joseph, your son, is dead. A wild animal must have killed him. You think your family's dysfunctional. I mean, 11 brothers all scheming together to get their story to line up, to go back and tell their dad that your youngest son is now dead. And in reality, they didn't kill him. They threw him in the pit, and they're trying to figure out what to do. And some Ishmaelite slave traders are passing by, and they was like, well, we can't kill him, but at least we could sell him and make something off of him. So they sell him to these traders. So that's kind of where we were left off last week, all right? So let's read Hebrews chapter 11, verse 22, where Joseph is mentioned in this Hall of Faith, and then we'll jump more into his story, all right? Verse 22 says, by faith Joseph at the end of his life made mention of the exodus of the Israelites and gave directions concerning his bones. Now, I'm just going to be honest with you. When I read this, I'm thinking of all the things that could be said of Joseph. I mean, this man had such an incredible life, such amazing things accomplished and done. And the writer of Hebrews just says, he talked about the exodus of the Israelites and gave some directions about his bones. Why would you just mention that? Of all the great things, that's what you chose? What is the significance of that statement? Well, I'm glad you asked, because next week Pastor Roy's going to answer it, not me. All right? So I'm just setting the table for him to come in and explain that for you a little bit more. Today we're going to build you towards that statement. So we're going to be in Genesis chapter 39 to begin with, and we're actually going to end up in chapter 41. Don't worry, we're not reading every verse, and we're not going to be super long. Just hang in here with me. If you'll listen fast, I'll preach fast. Let's jump into this. Genesis 39 verse 1. Now Joseph had been brought down to Egypt, and Potiphar, an officer of Pharaoh, the captain of the guard, an Egyptian, had bought him from the Ishmaelites who had brought him down there. The Lord was with Joseph, and he became a successful man, and he was in the house of his Egyptian master. His master saw that the Lord was with him, and that the Lord caused all that he did to succeed in his hands. So Joseph found favor in his sight and attended him, and he made him overseer of his house and put him in charge of all that he had. From the time that he had made him overseer in his house and over all that he had, the Lord blessed the Egyptian's house for Joseph's sake. The blessing of the Lord was on all that he had in house and field. So he left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Now Joseph was handsome in form and appearance. I want to talk to you just for the next little bit on this thought: faithfulness in all circumstances. Faithfulness in all circumstances. See, our faith is best explained when we not only profess it in our words, but we also demonstrate it through our actions. In other words, we need to make sure that our talk matches our walk. And there's several heroes of the faith that are mentioned here by the author of Hebrews, and their faith, though it's developed through a lot of different intense and private struggles, it brought them to moments in their life of decision and commitment. And these individuals, understand this, they were strong not because they had great amounts of faith, but because the object of their faith was God. And so that's the key. It's not that you've got to have this truckload of faith, it's the object of our faith, God. That's what makes the difference. And such is the case here with Joseph. Here's the picture for Joseph, all right? He's been brought up now out of this pit. He's been sold to some Ishmaelite slave traders. They have now brought Joseph into Egypt, and so now he's about to be auctioned off. But Joseph, can you just picture this with me for a minute? He's still in recovery, if you will. Like, his brothers beat him up, tossed him down in the pit. They didn't gently throw him in there. Like, here, let us help you down these steps. No, they were trying to kill him, so they didn't care. They just threw him in there. So he's banged up, bruised up, all that stuff. Then he's just been drug around, and he's brought here to Egypt to be auctioned off. And let's just go ahead and say it. He has hit rock bottom. He's quite a distance from the security of his family home. He's been placed probably now up on a platform where there's some chains. He's probably chained to a block because they don't want the slaves to run off and all of those kind of things. And he's most likely he's stripped bare. They might have left a loincloth on him, but given the customs and times, probably not. So here he is standing there. Can you imagine how humiliating that must have been for him? I mean, as a young teenage boy, this kind of humiliation would have just most likely caused what we would call PTSD today. I mean, he's standing there, and all of these people are just staring at him, looking him up and down, sizing him up to see if he's worth their money to purchase. Can you imagine the anxieties that must have been at the very core of this young man at this particular moment? So there he is standing there, and try to get with me a sense of kind of the pain of where he's at, the confusion that he must have had. Again, he's probably just now starting to kind of halfway come to. He's standing there, the sun's beating down on his naked body. He's trying to figure out where he's at, and he's at the same time he hears people yelling. He's like, I can't understand what they're saying. Wait a minute, it's a whole different language. Where am I at? He didn't understand the language. He's in a whole different country, a whole different language, and all he can do is try to read their eyes and read their body language and try to figure out what's about to happen next for him. So finally the auctioneer is like, sold. And so this part of the ordeal is over. And so most likely a couple of guards come and they get him. And the next thing Joseph realizes is he's walking into the swanky surroundings of this man Potiphar, who was, as we're told in verse 1, the captain of the guard. Now, this isn't in the notes that you have there on your app, but it's a good thing to take note of. There is no ideal place to serve God except the place where he sets you down. Let me say that again so it'll sink in. There's no ideal place to serve God except the place where he sets you down. Sure, it's possible there could have been worse people than Potiphar to have purchased Joseph. But being with Potiphar, still is not ideal. Listen, there is no ideal job. There is no ideal location. There's no ideal office. There's certainly no ideal church to join. There are good ones, but none of them are ideal. And those who constantly are searching for ideal or for perfection, what happens is they send themselves, or we send ourselves, on a journey that's marked by disappointment. And for Joseph, this was not ideal. No doubt, inside of him were emotions telling him to run, get away, hide, give up, and somehow God, in his wisdom, he will take Joseph, as we'll see, and he guides him through these valleys as well as the high spots. And so apparently Joseph decided somewhere along the way, once the initial shock of all this was absorbed, he's like, God's got to have some kind of wise purpose behind all of this in allowing me to be sold as a slave. Maybe he was thinking ahead to Romans 8:28. And we know that for those who love God, all things work together for good for those who are called according to his purpose. Maybe Joseph thought to himself, okay, if God wants me to be a slave, then I'm going to be the best slave in Egypt. I'm going to study my master until I know him better than he knows himself. I'm going to study his interest and make him my interest. I'm going to give every task that he gives to me, I'm going to do it to the best of my ability, not as unto Potiphar, but I'll tell you what, I'm going to do it as unto the Lord. As a matter of fact, I'm going to make myself God's bond slave in everything that I do. I'm just going to seek to please him. And see, a lot of times, unfavorable circumstances find us questioning our life instead of looking for ways to glorify God in them and through them. And so we have to learn that life's adversities, we have to learn from those things before we can ever be trusted with life's advancements. And so who would have thought anything good could have ever come out of Ravensbrück's death camp of the Nazis? But surely when she was incarcerated there as prisoner number 66730, Corrie ten Boom had to have questioned her life. Yet, in that place of torment and horror, that courageous young lady decided if she had to live in this suburb of hell, where the only way out for a Jew or a Jew sympathizer was through the smokestack of the crematorium, if death was to stare her in the face each and every day, if she had to live with such horrific atrocities, if she had to be subjected to indignity and intimidation, if she had to be whipped, if she had to be forever hungry, if she had to be terrorized day and night and day, well then she was going to be the very best inmate that Ravensbrück Horror Camp had ever had. So there in barracks number 28, she held Bible classes and she taught her fellow inmates how to face life and death with Jesus Christ. And as a result of her suffering in her later years of life, God would open up for her a worldwide ministry. See, her story's been told in books. Her story has been told on theater stages. Matter of fact, there's been a major film made about her life and has been shown in theaters around the world. And it's challenged and encouraged millions of people to just keep going. And I have no doubt that at many times in her life, Corrie ten Boom just had to sit there and say, why? Like, why, after I have risked my life trying to rescue persecuted Jews, why would I be forced into a boxcar, shoved in there with 80 other human beings? Why would I have to be packed in so tight that you could hardly breathe? Why would I have to endure such thirst? Why would I have to be forced to experience such filth, such sorrow over losing her weaker sister in all of this? But through her life, she found this out. Through her life and her testimony, through her ministry, thousands upon thousands of people have been led to give their life to Jesus because of her. God meant it unto good. And as we'll see later on, such is the case of Joseph. So Joseph committed to being the very best slave Potiphar ever had. Potiphar noticed. Like Potiphar saw that this Hebrew slave had all the makings of a really good manager because he was a good leader. Joseph was loyal. Joseph could be trusted. I mean, he worked well with other people. He just had this knack for figuring out a better way to do a lot of different things. And he was always willing to take on more and more responsibility. I can almost picture Potiphar. I've already told you, I used to be a kids pastor, so bear with me. My imagination can get out there sometimes. But I can almost picture Potiphar standing there in the officer's lounge, and he's talking to the other guys. Hey, boys, oh, let me tell you, I got me this new little Hebrew slave, and ever since I put him in charge, woo-hoo-hoo, business has picked up, baby. I mean, we are rolling over here. I don't know what it is about this guy, but whatever I give him to do, man, he does it, and it is done right, and it is awesome. I got this kid for a deal. Like the Ishmaelites came through, put him up. I got a steal on him, and it's proven to be the best deal I've ever made. I don't understand it. I can't explain it, but listen, the guy's awesome. He's a great leader. He's a great manager, and he's honest. I mean, I've never known of an honest slave. Have you? I mean, I don't know many honest men, and certainly no honest officials. So, hey, this guy, he is the picture of integrity, and he is all mine. So Joseph has favor now with Potiphar and has become his favorite. And Joseph is faithful, and Joseph is honorable. And so now he's promoted as high as he possibly could achieve while working for Potiphar. As a matter of fact, our text tells us, said, so he, Potiphar, left all that he had in Joseph's charge, and because of him, he had no concern about anything but the food he ate. Wow. Life goals, right? I have nothing to worry about tomorrow. I have nothing to worry about when I get home today except what's for lunch. That's the life Potiphar's living. But for Joseph, I am sure that there were times that he recalled the dreams that he had shared with his brothers. And the dreams that one day they were actually going to be bowing at his feet. And he knew these dreams were for God. So what is going on right now? Where is God in all of this? What Joseph was learning was the importance of patience and to trust in God's timing. God's ability to work all things for good, even through prolonged periods of waiting and suffering. And while Joseph in his integrity had kind of caught the eye of Potiphar and brought him a lot of success, it was his handsome form and appearance that had caught the eye of Miss Potiphar. In verse number 7, it says, after a time, his master's wife cast her eyes on Joseph. Now, if you were here last week, Miss Amelia makes the sermon graphics here, and there was a picture of Joseph there in this coat of many colors, and let's just say the picture made Joseph look very nice. So nice that my daughter in the middle of service texts my wife and says, "Ooh, Joseph. Who can blame Miss Potiphar?" Right? And I found out there was other girls having the same comments. But now look, it's not exactly clear how quickly she took notice of Joseph. What we do know is that after a while, she cast her eyes on him. Now, look, guys, we know when a girl starts casting her eyes at us, right? I mean, we know the look. Ladies, we're not as think as you dumb we are. When you're doing it, we know. We may not let you know. We may not play along with you right off the bat, but we know that look. And so Joseph walks by, and she's like, He walks by another time. He walks by another time. Like she's casting her eyes on him. And I'm reminded of the song we used to sing as kids. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. Oh, be careful, little eyes, what you see. 'Cause your Father up above is looking down in love. So be careful, little eyes, what you see. And Mrs. Potiphar was casting her eyes on him, and she didn't waste time letting him know what she wanted. She grabs him and says, lie with me. But verse 8 and 9, the Bible says, but he refused and said to his master's wife, behold, because of me, my master has no concern about anything in the house. And he's put everything that he has in my charge. He's not greater in this house than I am, and he's not kept anything from me except you, because you're his wife. How then can I do this great wickedness and sin against God? But she was relentless and she was strategic, because verse 11 says, one day he went into the house to do his work, and none of the men of the house was there in the house. And so she saw this opportunity, and she goes and grabs him by the coat. Mrs. Potiphar had her moment. Bingo. Now look, remember, Joseph is a long way from home. Dad's not around to come down on me for this, right? And my brothers aren't here to rat me out if I give in to this. Now, historically, we are taught that a man in Potiphar's position and his rank, they were known for their wives because their wives were the younger, attractive ladies. If you're not picking up what I'm throwing down, what I'm trying to tell you is she was smoking hot. And she grabs him by the coat. Lie with me. Joseph's a long way from home. And for a young man, this was a big opportunity for him, so to speak. But Joseph was a man of integrity. And instead of giving in, he says, look, I'm in charge of everything here. Potiphar, he doesn't deal with anything in the house anymore. He only cares about his food, and he's kept nothing from me but you. And now here's where he drops the truth bomb on her. He says, how can I do this great wickedness and sin against who? God. Not Potiphar, God. That was the kicker for him. In other words, there is no more powerful force in overcoming temptation than the fear of God. See, Proverbs 9:10 says the fear of God is the beginning of wisdom. Joseph feared God. And I worry sometimes that we're breeding a generation which, even in context of the church, does away with the belief of fearing God. Like I'm hearing from pulpits explain, we don't believe in the fear of God anymore, or we're tired of sermons on the fear of God. We don't like to think of God that way. You know, we just want to kind of be more comfortable and let's be a little bit more enduring. Okay, yeah, fine, go ahead. And adultery and immorality is absolutely rampant in and out of the church, all because we're letting go of the very foundational principle which stands against it, the fear of God. And when that is built into the life of a little boy, it'll make a difference no matter how deep he's buried in Egypt. But until it is, you can't even trust the kid next door to you. And somehow or another, Joseph had this woven into his life, and it was making a difference. He didn't come to Mrs. Potiphar and say, you know, I've thought about what you asked, and I don't want to hurt your feelings, but I'm going to have to say no. Because I don't share the same feelings, and I don't want to hurt you. And I'll be honest with you, I'm afraid word might get out. He doesn't approach it that way. He just looks at her and says, I'm not going to do this. Like, how could I do this? Such a wicked thing and sin against God. Joseph was learning to live with integrity and to trust God with the results. So he turns her down. He runs away. She's left there holding his coat. She's humiliated, and so she screams out, makes all these claims that he tried to take advantage of her. And so Potiphar's left with only one choice: toss him in prison. You know, it's bad enough to have been sold into slavery because of your coat. Now he's thrown in prison because of his coat. And to this point, we've been focusing on his integrity and how he's able to carry out all these different responsibilities with a lot of composure and able to handle a lot of different situations with clarity. And yet what we're about to be confronted with is not his integrity, but rather his human weakness. Now, we don't have time to read all of chapter 40, but let's read a few verses just to set the stage. Chapter 40, verse 1 says, sometime after this, the cupbearer of the king of Egypt and his baker committed an offense against their lord, the king of Egypt. And Pharaoh was angry with his two officers, the chief cupbearer and the chief baker, and he put them in custody in the house of the captain of the guard in the prison where Joseph was confined. The captain of the guard appointed Joseph to be with them, and he attended them. And they continued for some time in custody. And one night they both dreamed, the cupbearer and the baker of the king of Egypt, who were confined in the prison, each his own dream, and each dream with its own interpretation. And when Joseph came to them in the morning, he saw that they were troubled. So he asked Pharaoh's officers who were with him in custody in his master's house, why are your faces downcast today? And they said to him, we've had dreams and there's no one to interpret them. And Joseph said to him, do not interpretations belong to God? Please tell them to me. So the chief cupbearer told his dream to Joseph. Joseph tells him what it means. Then the baker shares his dream, and Joseph interprets that. So let me just go ahead and tell you this. For Joseph, he recognized that ultimately all of his days and all of his decisions were all under God's care. But he also recognized that God had given him a mind that he could use to think for himself, that he had given him the ability to take some initiative, that he had made him influential in different ways. And so he's not unwilling to take some initiative right now in relationship to his circumstances, and particularly in trying to change them. Because in verse number 14, he looks at the cupbearer and he says, "Only remember me when it's well with you, and please do me the kindness to mention me to Pharaoh, and so get me out of this house." See, what's happened is Joseph interpreted both of their dreams. And so for the cupbearer, Joseph says, your dream is this. It works out well for you, because in 3 days, your circumstances are going to change dramatically. You're no longer going to be in this prison. Instead, your head's going to be lifted up. You'll be restored to freedom and to your former position. And so the idea of the release from this jail probably triggers the mind of Joseph and his own personal interest now in being removed from this prison, right? Like, how can I prophesy to him that he's going to get out of here, and not at least look at him and say, "Hey, buddy, I'd like to get out of here"? I mean, nobody could blame him for that. And so in his humanity, in his normalcy, he look at what he says. Listen, he's like, "Look, when all goes well with you, remember me, show me kindness, mention me to Pharaoh, get me out of this prison." And he goes on in verse 15, he says, "For I was indeed stolen out of the land of the Hebrews, and here also I've done nothing that they should put me into this pit." And so the cupbearer has to be looking at him thinking, well, you know, you got a point there. I mean, he would have understood Joseph's request and why Joseph was being so straightforward and saying, "Remember me, put in a good word for me." Because it was an appeal to human kindness. It was a very normal thing from one man to another. For time's sake, I'm not going to go into details about the chief baker's dream, but just understand his dream did not turn out as good as the chief cupbearer's dream. Sure, he's going to be lifted out of prison in 3 days, but only to be executed, to be put to death. So we've got two prisoners, two dreams, and two very different outcomes. So 3 days now goes by. Joseph's interpreted their dreams. 3 days go by, and Pharaoh has a birthday, and he decided to give a feast to all of his officials. And just as Joseph had said, the prisoners are called up. The chief cupbearer was restored to his position, and then the chief baker was then executed. And I wish we could spend a little bit more time here, but verse 23, look at what kind of guy this cupbearer turns out to be. "Yet the chief cupbearer did not remember Joseph, but forgot him." Forgot him. The guy who 3 days ago told you you were going to be restored to freedom in your position, and you just forgot him. I kind of think of this guy as he's walking out of the prison that day, looking at the other prisoners. "Hey, man, sorry, but I'll be thinking about you, okay? Hey, it's been good getting to know you. I'm sorry you're having to stay, but they've called me up." And then he comes along to Joseph, and he probably goes over and just gives him a good old right hand shake, puts the other hand on him, and says, "Joe, man, I'm not going to forget you. I mean, I've heard everything you had to say. Joe, I'm your man. I'm going to help you out here." So it's only natural that for Joseph to assume that there was some level of expectation in his heart in the early days after the cupbearer has been released. I mean, everybody that started coming into that prison, every time he heard somebody open those doors, Joseph had to be filled with anticipation, saying, "Whoever that is coming around the corner, they got to be for me. This is the day the cupbearer has put in a good word for me, and I'm getting out of here." In today's terms, it would have been like, "Hey, if the phone rings, don't pick it up. It's for me. That call's coming in for me." And so people's coming into that jail. The first one comes in, nothing happens. The second one comes in, nothing happens. The third one, nothing. Now a week goes by. 2 weeks go by. Now a month goes by. Nothing's changed. 2 months, 3 months, 4 months. And everyone in this prison, including Joseph, knew there's not going to be a call from the cupbearer. Here's the thing. People fail us and let us down. It's just how life goes. Things that we think are going to go differently don't happen as we anticipate. Even the best of people prove to be a disappointment to us at times. And why not? I mean, how often do we prove to be a disappointment to others? That's why our reliance shouldn't be on each other. It shouldn't be in man. It shouldn't be in woman. Our reliance should be and is on God. So we come to Genesis 41:1. It says, after 2 whole years, Pharaoh dreamed. And he had a dream that he was standing by the Nile. Now look, I can't tell you that if this date was from the time Joseph was first thrown into prison or whether we date it from the time the cupbearer was released. But the point is that Joseph was in this situation for a lot longer than he ever thought he would be. I mean, he was there for far too long for someone. I mean, keep in mind, he's not committed a crime. It's not like he was in jail because he had violated some kind of code of ethics or that he had disobeyed his master. He was in jail on some kind of trumped up charge. And the little glimmer of human hope that he had left when the cupbearer was released, that's now diminished. And so he was living, or had lived, for 2 years with disappointed hopes. And as he watched hour after hour, day after day, week after week, month after month, he must have thought to himself at some point, dear God, what in the world is going on here? I mean, he had plenty of time for those kind of thoughts. So maybe in his mind, he starts playing the video reel back of his life, and it wouldn't surprise me at all if it started somewhere around the time his dad gave him the coat. And he's thinking to himself, you know, maybe if I just hadn't received that coat, maybe if I just hadn't had the dreams, but still those dreams, it just seemed to be that they were significant. I mean, the dreams seemed to suggest that I was going to be exalted. And so far, I haven't come close to anything like that. I mean, I got strapped to the back of a camel and sold into somebody's house, and then I got dumped into a hole because some lady trumped up false allegations, and I'm stuck here for 2 years. How in the world is this going to play out? Maybe he's thinking like the psalmist, oh God, how long will you forget me? Forever? I mean, how long will you hide your face from me? So a quick recap here. Joseph was opposed, imprisoned, criticized, misunderstood, slandered, falsely accused, and wrongfully persecuted. Other than that, he was having a pretty good day. But it may be that some of those words seem to fit your bill this morning. How's your day been? How's your week been? Do any of these words fit you this morning? Opposed, criticized, misunderstood, falsely accused, wrongfully persecuted? Please hear what I'm about to say. The presence of suffering in your life is not an indication of the absence of Jesus in your life. See, I hear Christians all the time. I thought I was a follower of Christ. I thought I had trusted in Him, but how could this be? I mean, I'm going through so much in my life. How could Jesus be mine and love me if I'm going through all these things? You've got to understand that just because there's suffering in your life does not mean that you're absent of Jesus in your life. See, here's a lesson for us to learn. Joseph had patience. I mean, he's a life-sized illustration of Romans 8:28. And although the days may seem dark, and it may seem like there's no potential for anything to change, still God is working everything out in compliance with His purpose and His will, not ours. And see, He makes everything beautiful in His time. I believe that's what the heroes of the faith were to discover, as the writer to the Hebrews describes in chapter 11. The individuals that we've mentioned, some of the big names, Abraham, Noah, Moses, now Joseph. Look, but there were other people who were described in verse 13. He described them this way. All these people were still living by faith when they died. They did not receive the things promised. They only saw them and welcomed them from a distance. And they admitted that they were aliens and strangers on earth. What a wonderful group. What a commendable group. I mean, they hadn't fallen prey to our 21st century preoccupation of faster. On Amazon Prime and see if they can't deliver it tomorrow. Well, fine, I'll run to Target because we've got to have everything right now. But these people, they were patient. So 2 years goes by, and Pharaoh now has two dreams. But these 2 dreams were extraordinary dreams. These were a foreshadowing of God's intervention in the life of an unbeliever. Something stirring into this person's existence that kind of awakened him in the morning was something that a bit more than, that was a strange dream. But they were. I mean, the idea that these ugly, scrawny cows are eating the big, fat, sleek, shiny cows. That's bizarre, right? Who has that kind of dream? And corn, dry, shriveled up corn is now eating really nice corn. Can you imagine walking downstairs for breakfast tomorrow morning, looking at your wife? Honey, you are not going to believe what I dreamed. These big old, these little scrawny cows just went and ate and devoured all these little, or these big old fat shiny cows, and then these dried up shriveled ears of corn just walks over here and eats all of this beautiful, gorgeous, healthy corn, and she's going to say, I've told you, you need to quit eating pizza before you go to bed at night. But these were some bizarre dreams. And so he comes down and he tells everybody around him because he's got nobody else to tell. But here's the thing. See, cows and grain represented prosperity and security in Egypt. And so he's troubled. He wakes up and he wakes up concerned and he looks around for help. And so like Humpty Dumpty, who fell off the wall, he calls all the king's horses, all the king's men. Actually, verse 8 says he calls all the wise men, all the magicians, and he told them this. He begins to tell them his dreams. But what could these guys do? Nothing. They're a little bit embarrassed. They're probably got their heads down and eventually just have to look and say, Pharaoh, look, I hear what you're telling us, but sorry, we can't tell you what that means. You've stumped us on this one. And then all of a sudden, the cupbearer remembers Joseph. 2 years later, he remembers Joseph. And he goes over to Pharaoh and he says, hey, listen, when you put me in prison that time 2 years ago, I know you really didn't mean it, but you got me out. So it's all good. No grudges here, Pharaoh. No grudges. But when I was in prison, I met this guy. His name was Joseph. I had a dream that Chief Baker, the one that you killed 2 years ago, yeah, that guy, he and I both had dreams, and Joseph told us what they meant, and everything that he said was going to happen, happened. So Pharaoh, his interest peaks up a little bit here, and he says, you know what, let's go get him. And so Joseph is now finding himself standing before Pharaoh, and Pharaoh looks at him and says, I hear that you're good at interpreting dreams. Well, I don't think Pharaoh was surprised or was expecting to hear what Joseph's response was about to be, because Joseph looked at him and said, I'm sorry, I can't do that. Pharaoh's like, what do you mean you can't do that? These guys told me you did it for them. You've got to do this. I'm counting on you to do this. And Joseph's like, no, I can't do it, but God can do it. And you want to hear what happens next? Good, come back next week because Pastor Roy picks up here. I got cliffhangers for you. Just saying. Look, what can we learn here from Joseph about unjust suffering and our response to that unjust suffering? How is it possible for us to be faithful in all circumstances? 4 quick things and we're done, and I promise you they're quick. Number 1, don't be surprised when you suffer unjustly. Don't be surprised when you suffer unjustly. 1 Peter 4:12, beloved, do not be surprised at the fiery trial when it comes upon you to test you, as though something strange were happening to you. You see, we have this tendency to regard suffering as some kind of strange misfortune, to regard suffering as totally impossible for anyone who's following Jesus. And if it was this much of a concern for first century Cappadocia, which is where Peter, this is his audience that he's writing to, I think it's also a major concern for our 21st century Northeast Ohio, because the same perspective is so widespread today. So many people are living with this mistaken idea that, hey, it's all good now. I made a commitment to Christ. Like, I gave my life to him. I love him. And hey, Romans 8:28, all things God works for good if you love him. And somehow we have made that correspond to our health, to our security, to our freedom, and everything else that we want it to be. We've put it all together in this nice little bundle, so anybody who is living with that kind of idea of what it means to be a Christian, they're going to be surprised at unjust suffering. Because from that perspective, suffering really has no place in our theology at all. Where did we get this idea that service for Christ is some kind of insurance policy against trials and pain and persecution? Where did we find that we have the right to go to bed angry at God because we lost our job, or because our health was failing, or because everything didn't work out like we wanted it to? Where did we get this idea that the Christian life was some kind of a bargain? Like, hey, God, I'm going to do something good today, and then you do 2 good things for me. And I know you're not going to let down on your end of the bargain, right? I don't know where we got it from, but I know where we didn't get it from. We didn't find that in the Bible. 1 Peter 2:20 says, but if when you do good and suffer for it you endure, this is a gracious thing in the sight of God. If we go back to Hebrews 11 and the great heroes of the faith, the great picture gallery of all of those who are following Christ, the writer goes on through and identifies individuals, but he eventually comes to a more generic statement regarding some of these other people, a great amount of people who had suffered unjustly for Christ. And listen what he says. Others suffered mocking and flogging, even chains and imprisonment. They were stoned. They were sawn in two. They were killed with a sword. They went about in skins of sheep and goats, destitute, afflicted, mistreated. And I love this, of whom the world was not worthy, wandering about in deserts and mountains and in dens and caves of the earth. Why? Because of their commitment to Jesus Christ. Not because they had done something bad or done something wrong, but because they were committed to following Christ and doing good things. So don't be surprised when you suffer unjustly, but don't throw in the towel. Don't throw in the towel. Joseph, is in viewing his circumstances, had every reason, humanly speaking, to say, hey, I give up. I mean, I might as well just start doing what everyone else does. I don't see how all of this or any of this is working out for my good right now. I mean, I try to do the right thing for my father, I get thrown in a pit. I try to be nice to my brothers, they strap me to the back of a camel, send me off, sell me off somewhere here in Egypt as a slave. I get there, I try to do the right thing there, and I get thrown in jail because of some perverse woman. I don't think I deserve any of this, so I might as well just change it up a bit and do what everybody else is doing. And we can look at Joseph and say, no, he should never think that. Well, have you ever entertained that kind of temptation? Like, you ever felt like that? I really don't need to keep this up. I don't think anybody's really paying attention to little old me. I mean, I don't see the need to keep purity in my marriage. I don't see the need to attend church and learn more about God. Why should I read the Bible and pray? I mean, there's really nothing to that stuff anyway, and I don't think there's a benefit to it. I mean, after all these jacklegs, quote Pastor Roy from a couple of weeks ago, if you were watching. You're welcome. Shout out to him. Thanks for the word. But all these jacklegs around me here, they're doing it all wrong. They're having a great time. I'm doing it all right, and I'm in the pit. F.B. Meyer says this, do right because it is right to do right. And when you determine to do right because it is right to do right, then when you're misunderstood, ill-treated, when you're the victim of unjust suffering, you won't swerve, you won't sit down, you won't whine, and you won't despair. And that's the wonderful thing about Joseph. I mean, how is it that he's so absent from whining? I mean, yeah, he would like to get out of this prison, and he even makes a request to do so, but he's not a whiner. You don't hear him moaning and groaning and complaining because he's determined to do the right thing. And he determined to be faithful to God in all circumstances. He says, you know what? I'm going to do the right thing no matter what it costs, no matter where it puts me. I'm just going to do right because it's right to do right. So don't throw in the towel. The other day I'm working in my yard, and my neighbor across the street, by the way, I'm so glad to have my next door neighbors here with me today. Dave and Nancy, thank y'all so much for being here. Best neighbors you could ever have. I'm going to hold you to paying me for saying that. But my neighbor across the street, Mr. Bill, he's a retired pastor. And I'm working in my yard the other day, and I don't know, Bill's got to be in his mid-80s. His wife passed away a couple of years ago from cancer, and I'm out there working, and Bill walks across the street to me, and he's talking with me. He just wants to hear how things are going, how's his ministry going, how's our church doing. He loves our church. He prays for Pastor. We always ask about you and how you're doing. And we talked there for a minute, and he turns around and says, well, we got to keep going. We are closer than ever before. There is no time to quit. Let's just keep going. 85, 86 years old, and determined, I am not going to throw in the towel. And I love what Jody says about Mr. Bill. She says he just oozes Jesus, and I want to have that same testimony myself. There is no reason for any of us in here to ever throw in the towel. but then don't take revenge. This is the most litigated society I think there's ever been. I wouldn't be shocked if we researched and found out that here in the United States, there's more lawsuits than anywhere else in the world. Because our society is so litigated because people are so vengeful. I mean, people are singing, you know, I'll get you. I'll get you in the end. Yes, I will. I'll get you in the end. Okay, no Beatles fans in here, sorry. But listen, the instructions in Romans 12:17, repay no one evil for evil, but give thought to do what is honorable in the sight of all. And he goes on, beloved, never avenge yourselves, but leave it to the wrath of God, for it's written, vengeance is mine. I will repay, says the Lord. To the contrary, if your enemy is hungry, feed him. For if he's thirsty, give him something to drink, for by so doing, you will heap burning coals on his head. Don't be overcome by evil, but overcome evil with good. It is such a waste of time for us to spend our lives trying to clear ourselves, trying to justify ourselves, trying to explain our motives, and explain this and explain that, and get everything back in order just as it once was. Forget it. And I can speak from experience on this. There was a time when someone hacked my email, and they took pieces of this email and this email and this email and strung it all together and make it say something that would never come out of my mouth. And to make matters worse, they took that and they mailed that to every parent who had a student in my student ministry. And we had a Christian school. They put it on every teacher's desk when they walked into school the next day. At the same time, guess where I'm at? I'm at youth camp with the teenagers, 2 states away. What can I do? I come back and I just want to go to all of, that's not what happened. Look, I can prove, here's the email. I didn't say that. That's not me. Instead, our elders and the rest of the staff stood there on the platform and they said, something's happened, but we know his character. This isn't the way it is. I didn't try to do anything except just stay focused. And I'm not saying that I'm the guy, I'm the example. I'm just saying when we want to take revenge, our best course of action is to trust God. God will vindicate in due time. It may be days, it may be months, it may be years, it may not even be until we get to heaven, and that's okay. Just don't take revenge. Here's the last thing. Don't miss the chance to help others. When you're on the receiving end of unjust suffering, don't miss the chance to help others. I mean, isn't that the wonderful thing that we find here in Genesis 40, the interest in the sensitivity of Joseph? I mean, did he have a big problem? Certainly. Did he have a reason for a grudge? Without question. Could he have spent his whole life consumed with his own little problems? Absolutely. But what did Joseph do? Well, in verse 6, he notices that these 2 men are depressed. And the reason he notices is because he's looking. And the reason he's looking is because he cares. Not only does he notice they're depressed, but in verse 7, he cares enough to ask why they're depressed. He's looking for an opportunity to help others. Leslie Flynn, he's a pastor, I think in New Jersey, but he wrote a little booklet on Joseph. And in that booklet, he tells the story of this seminary professor who had just fallen into a huge state of depression. There had been some things said and just circumstances, and he's just depressed and kind of given up on anything and anyone. And so one of his friends decided to go pay him a visit, and he sat down with him and began to talk, and he said, look, think about trying this. Get a sheet of paper and a pencil and just start making a list of all the names of people who have been good to you in your life. Just write that list down, and when you get done making that list, pick one of those names out, and why don't you take a minute and just write them a letter of gratitude. So the guy leaves, the professor's there, and a couple of days goes by, and he's like, you know what, why not? So he gets out a sheet of paper and a pen, and he begins to make this list of all these names, and somewhere in there, this image pops up in his head of a teacher that he had when he was just a young boy. And she's really the one that had inspired him to really love to read and to enjoy poetry and literature and all the things that go along with it. So he decided to write her a note of gratitude and express to her how she influenced him to have this great love of books. Well, to his surprise, in a couple of weeks, he gets this letter in the mail in response to his letter of gratitude. And it's in the handwriting of an older lady who had been retired for many years. It's a little shaky, but here's what her note said. Dear William, when I read your letter, I was blinded with tears, for I remember you as a little fella in my class. You have warmed my old heart. I've taught school for 50 years, and yours is the first letter of thanks that I've ever received from a student, and I shall cherish it until I die. That professor read that, and suddenly there was a little sparkle of hope back in his heart. And so he goes back to his list and he gets another name and he writes them a letter of gratitude. And then he writes another letter and another one until by the time it was said and done, over 500 letters of gratitude he had written and sent out. And people said, when you go to describe that guy now, you cannot in any way, shape, or form say that man is depressed. Why? Because like Joseph, he finally figured it out. There's no reason for surprise. There's no reason to throw in the towel. There's no reason for revenge. And there's no reason to miss the opportunity to help others. Look, we might not all be thrown in wells, put in prisons, or made governors over an entire country, but we have one very important detail in common with Joseph. No matter what evil occurs in our lives, God's always capable of turning it completely around for his good. So I want to encourage all of us this morning. Let's be faithful in all circumstances. Let's learn to view life's challenges as preparation for God's greater purpose. Let's bow our heads for just a moment. Joseph is a great example and really challenges us with this idea of being faithful in all of our sufferings and all of life's circumstances. We should be faithful to God because he's constantly faithful to us. He never fails. He never lets us down. But my concern as a pastor and a follower of Jesus this morning is that some of you may be sitting here this morning and you have no clue what any of this means. Like you can't understand how Joseph could put his faith in a God that you can't see. Maybe it's challenged you to sit there and think and reflect and look at your own life and say, I'm not 100% sure about all of this. I don't really know that there's ever been a time in my life where I have prayed and invited Christ into my life. I don't know what you're talking about. Well, here's the thing. Here's what you need to know. This is the gospel, that we've all sinned and fallen short of God's glory. And the penalty for our sins is death. That is an eternal separation from God. Well, God would never love me. Oh, to the contrary. You know how much God loves you and I? You know what we're worth to him? We're worth Jesus, because he loves you and I enough that he gave his one and only son to die on a cross for our sins for the sole purpose that we could one day place our faith and trust in him and him alone to be our Savior. And so if you're sitting here this morning and there's never been a time in your life where you can remember praying and inviting Jesus into your life, I would love to invite you to do that today. Well, I would like to do that, Pastor Jamey, but I'm not 100% sure how to do that. Well, let me help you with a little prayer. Now, understand, this isn't some magical little spell that we're saying here. These aren't magical words. It's your faith in him as you pray. But if you need help with a prayer, you can follow behind me something like this. Dear Jesus, I know I'm a sinner and I've messed up, and I'm so sorry for that. And I understand there is no way, there is not enough good that I could ever do to earn my way into heaven. There's only one way for that, and that's for you to be my Savior. So the best way I know how, Jesus, I'm asking you to forgive me of my sins, and I'm placing my faith right now in you and you alone to be my Savior, so that heaven will be my home when I die.